Here is something that many people don't know. For most of recorded history, the majority of children living inside orphanages were not actually orphans. This is not a fringe claim or a revisionist theory. It is supported by historical studies, institutional records, and the work of researchers who have spent years examining this particular period of child welfare history. The numbers, when examined carefully, point toward a pattern that the common understanding of orphanages does not account for. Studies from the 19th and early 20th centuries suggest that somewhere around 90% of children placed in these institutions had at least one living parent. Some had two. That figure comes up repeatedly across different countries, different time periods, and different types of institutions. It is not unique to one region or one decade. It appears consistently enough that researchers have had to ask a serious question. What exactly were these places, and who were they actually serving? That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 90%. In almost any other context, if 9 out of 10 members of a group did not actually meet the basic definition of that group, we would question whether the label was accurate. We would ask whether something about the category itself was misleading. But for most of modern history, that question was rarely asked about orphanages. The name was accepted. The purpose was assumed. And the children inside were understood, by the public at least, to be without family. When most people hear the word orphanage, they picture a specific kind of child. A child with no family, no one to return to, no parent waiting somewhere with a letter or a plan. The word carries a weight that most people absorb early, from literature, from history lessons, from cultural memory. The orphan is a particular figure, defined precisely by absence. No mother. No father. Alone in the world. But the historical record tells a different story. These were not, in the majority of cases, children abandoned by the world. Many of them had parents who were alive. Parents who knew where their children were. Parents who had, in some documented cases, personally walked their children to the institution's entrance and handed them over themselves. The separation was real. But in many cases, the family was not gone. It was simply somewhere else, continuing to exist, while the child remained inside the institution. This detail changes the picture considerably, and it raises questions that are difficult to set aside once they have been noticed. Why would a living parent place their child inside an institution designed, at least in name, for children without parents? The question sounds straightforward, but the answer is not. There are explanations, and those explanations will be examined. But before the explanations are considered, the pattern itself deserves full attention. Because this was not an occasional occurrence. It was not a rare exception to an otherwise clear system. Researchers looking at admission records from orphanages in the United States, in Britain, in parts of Europe, and in Australia have found the same thing again and again. Children with living parents. Children with known addresses. Children whose families were documented in the intake records even as the institutions presented themselves publicly as homes for orphans. The pattern appears across countries that had different governments, different cultures, different religious traditions, and different legal systems. That consistency is one of the things that makes this history difficult to explain away as a local problem or an institutional accident. When something appears in that many places, across that many decades, it usually reflects something structural, something built into the system itself, not just the behavior of a few isolated institutions. At first, this seems like it might have a simple explanation. And there is an official one, which will be addressed. But the official explanation, while reasonable on its surface, does not fully account for everything the records show. That gap, between the explanation offered and the evidence available, is where the real questions begin. One of the things that makes this history harder to trace is the condition of the records themselves. Many orphanage archives from the 19th and early 20th centuries are incomplete. Some were lost over time. Some were damaged. Some were never properly maintained in the first place. A number of institutions kept detailed public-facing reports that presented their work in favorable terms, while their internal intake documents told a more complicated story. Researchers who have compared these two types of records have sometimes found significant differences between them. Differences in the numbers reported, in how children were described, and in what information was included or left out. That inconsistency between the public record and the internal record is something that comes up more than once in this history. It is worth keeping in mind as the broader story unfolds. There is also the question of what the word orphan actually meant during this period. In common usage today, it typically means a child whose parents are both dead. But in the 19th century, the definition was used more loosely, sometimes to describe any child who was dependent, unsupported, or without a capable guardian, regardless of whether their parents were alive. Some institutions applied the term to children whose fathers had died, even if their mothers were living. Others used it for children whose parents were present but considered unfit or unable to provide care. The word, in other words, was not always used precisely. And that imprecision may have made it easier for the public framing of these institutions to diverge from what was actually happening inside them. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because if the word orphan was being used to describe children who were not orphans in any conventional sense, then the entire public identity of these institutions was built on a definition that didn't match the reality it claimed to represent. That is not a small thing. It shaped how these places were funded, how they were perceived, and how little scrutiny they received from the communities around them. The question of why living parents placed their children in these institutions is one that does not have a single clean answer. Some believe it was purely a matter of poverty and desperation, with no deeper explanation needed. Others look at the structural details, the incentives, the legal frameworks, the power imbalances between institutions and poor families, and conclude that the situation was more complicated than simple hardship alone can explain. And there are researchers who fall somewhere between those two positions, acknowledging that poverty was real and significant while also noting that the system surrounding these families was not neutral. It was designed in specific ways, by specific people, with specific outcomes in mind. Which of those interpretations is most accurate is something that historians have not fully agreed upon. The evidence supports different conclusions depending on which records are examined and how they are weighted. That ongoing disagreement is itself part of what makes this history worth examining. It suggests that the simple narrative, charitable institutions rescuing children in need, does not capture everything that was happening. And perhaps most importantly, it suggests that the children inside these institutions were not always there for the reasons the institutions said they were. They were not always orphans. Their families were not always absent. The story told publicly about these places did not always match the story recorded in the documents those same institutions kept privately. Why did this pattern exist across so many places and so many years? Why would a system built in the name of child welfare consistently house children whose parents were still alive? And why does the official history of this period struggle to fully answer those questions even now, long after the institutions themselves have mostly closed? These are not questions with comfortable answers. But they are questions that the records raise. And when records raise questions that the official explanation does not fully resolve, that is usually a sign that something in the full story has not yet been found, or has not yet been told. What is certain is that the number, 90%, does not fit neatly into the story most people carry about what orphanages were and what they did. It introduces a doubt that is difficult to set aside. And once that doubt is present, the rest of this history looks slightly different. Not completely different, but different enough to make the questions feel necessary rather than optional. The history of child welfare in the 19th and early 20th centuries is usually told as a story of progress. Of reformers recognizing a problem and building systems to address it. Of institutions stepping in where families could not. That version of the story is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. And the incompleteness begins right here, with a number that most people have never encountered and that the official version of this history has never fully explained. 90%. Most of the children in orphanages had living parents. That is where this investigation begins. And it does not resolve as quickly, or as cleanly, as the word orphanage might suggest. The accepted explanation for this pattern is straightforward. It is rooted in poverty. According to mainstream historians and child welfare scholars, the 19th and early 20th centuries were among the most economically difficult periods in modern history for working-class families. Industrialization was transforming entire societies at a speed that most ordinary people were not prepared for. And the consequences of that transformation fell most heavily on those who had the least. Millions of families moved from rural areas into cities during this period. They came looking for work, for wages, for some form of stability. What many of them found instead was something considerably harder. Urban wages were low and unpredictable. Housing in industrial cities was overcrowded, expensive relative to what workers earned, and often shared between multiple families in conditions that made daily life genuinely precarious. A single illness, a single lost job, a single unexpected expense could be enough to destabilize a household entirely. There was no social safety net in the modern sense. There were no government programs designed to catch families before they fell. If a family's income disappeared, there was very little standing between them and complete destitution. This is the world that the official explanation asks us to understand. And it is important to understand it clearly, because the economic reality of the era was severe. This was not a world of mild inconvenience. For working-class families in the industrial cities of Britain, the United States, Ireland, and much of Europe, the margin between survival and collapse was extremely thin. And when that margin disappeared, families sometimes had to make choices that were not really choices at all. They were decisions made under pressure, with no good options available. The official explanation holds that orphanages emerged, in part, to serve these families. When a parent died, became seriously ill, lost steady employment, or simply reached a point where feeding and housing their children was no longer possible, institutions provided a solution. They offered shelter, meals, basic education, and physical safety. They were places where a child could survive while the parent's situation remained unresolved. According to this explanation, orphanages functioned less like places of permanent last resort and more like a form of temporary emergency care. The understanding, sometimes formal, often informal, was that a parent could place a child inside the institution during a period of crisis, and once that crisis had passed, the child could return home. The separation was not meant to be permanent. It was meant to be practical. A bridge between a moment of crisis and a return to stability. This concept is sometimes referred to in the historical literature as family preservation through institutional care. The phrase is worth examining on its own terms. It frames the separation of parent and child as an act of preservation rather than abandonment. The logic being that keeping a family technically intact, even while physically separated, was preferable to allowing children to suffer or starve while remaining in the home. The institution, in this framing, was not replacing the family. It was holding the child in trust until the family was capable of functioning again. That framing made a certain kind of sense within the moral and social language of the era. Poverty was widely understood as a temporary condition, something that could be overcome with hard work, good character, and a change in circumstances. Placing a child temporarily in an institution was therefore not seen, in many quarters, as a failure of parenthood. It was seen as a responsible decision made by a parent who understood their own limitations and chose to act accordingly. It is a reasonable explanation. On its surface, it accounts for the scale of the problem and the nature of the pressures families faced. And importantly, it is supported by actual evidence. Records from various institutions show that some children were indeed collected by their parents after a period of weeks or months. Reunion did happen. Families did sometimes recover, return, and bring their children home. These cases exist in the historical record and are not disputed. So the explanation is not fabricated. It has a genuine foundation. The economic hardship was real. The lack of alternatives was real. And the intention, at least in some cases, was genuinely temporary. Researchers who have studied this period point to personal letters, admission notes, and institutional communications that reflect parents making painful but rational decisions in impossible circumstances. At first, this all seems to hold together. The picture is difficult, but it is coherent. Poor families, overwhelmed by industrial poverty, used available institutions as a form of crisis management. Children went in. Some came back out. The system, however imperfect, served a real need. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because if the arrangement was primarily intended to be temporary, the broader pattern of outcomes does not always reflect that intention. Looking at the full body of records, not just the cases where reunification occurred, but the complete picture of what happened to children who entered these institutions. The temporary shelter explanation starts to feel like it is describing only part of the story. For every case where a parent returned and a child went home, there are cases where that did not happen. Children who stayed for years. Children who were never collected. Children who left the institution not by returning to their families but by being placed into labor arrangements, sent to farms, apprenticed to tradespeople, or transferred to other institutions in different cities or different countries. These outcomes are also in the record. And they are not rare exceptions. They appear with enough regularity to raise questions about how temporary these arrangements actually were in practice, as opposed to how temporary they were intended to be at the moment of admission. There is also the question of what the phrase family preservation through institutional care actually meant when applied to real families in real situations. The concept sounds balanced and humane. But the power relationship embedded in it was not balanced at all. The family, typically poor, often lacking legal knowledge, sometimes from immigrant communities unfamiliar with local institutions, had very little formal standing once a child was admitted. The institution, by contrast, had considerable authority over what happened next. If an institution decided that a child should remain, or that a parent was not yet ready to receive their child back, there were limited formal mechanisms for a parent to challenge that decision. That imbalance is something that the official explanation tends to understate. The framing of mutual agreement, parent and institution working together toward the child's eventual return, assumes a degree of equality between the two parties that the actual legal and social landscape of the era did not always support. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because what looks, from a distance, like a voluntary arrangement between struggling families and helpful institutions starts to look more complicated when the specific details are examined. What exactly did parents understand when they signed admission documents? What were they told about their rights? What recourse did they have if they changed their mind? These are questions that the official explanation does not consistently answer. Not because the answers are necessarily damning, but because in many cases the answers are simply not clear from the records that survive. There is another dimension to this that deserves attention. The official explanation focuses almost entirely on the motivations and circumstances of the families involved. It describes poverty, crisis, and limited options. What it tends not to examine with equal care is the motivations and circumstances of the institutions themselves. Orphanages were not passive recipients of children placed by desperate families. They were active organizations with their own operational needs, their own funding structures, and their own institutional interests. Understanding why families place children in orphanages is only half of the question. The other half is understanding what the institutions themselves were doing, and why. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because the records do not only show long stays. They also show something else, something that the prolonged poverty explanation does not account for as neatly. They show that many children who entered these institutions never returned to their families at all. Not after a year. Not after several years. Not ever. They left the institutions through other means entirely. Placed into labor arrangements, sent to work in domestic service, apprenticed to tradespeople, transferred to farms, or moved to other institutions in different cities, sometimes in different countries. The scale of this non-return is significant. This was not a small minority of unusual cases. Researchers examining orphanage records from this period have found that in many institutions, the proportion of children who left by returning to their family of origin was considerably lower than the proportion who left through some other arrangement. If the system was designed for temporary care and eventual family reunion, then the exits from the system should predominantly reflect that design. In many cases, they do not. There is also the matter of family visits during a child's time inside the institution. If parents placed their children with the understanding that the arrangement was temporary, you would expect them to maintain regular contact. Visits, letters, small gestures of continued connection. These are the natural behaviors of a parent who intends to reclaim their child when circumstances allow. They are also the behaviors of a parent who has not emotionally or legally surrendered their relationship with their child. But the visiting records from many institutions during this period do not reflect that pattern. In a number of documented cases, parental visits were infrequent. Some children received no visits at all after the initial admission. This could be explained, in part, by distance. Some parents moved in search of work and could not easily travel back to visit. It could also be explained by shame, by poverty, by the difficulty of taking time away from work. These are real factors that would have affected behavior. However, the timeline does not fully match a story of reluctant, temporary separation. When visits are rare, correspondence is minimal, and years pass without contact, the picture of an engaged parent waiting for the right moment to bring their child home becomes harder to sustain. It does not prove that parents stopped caring, but it raises questions about what the nature of the arrangement actually was, and whether everyone involved understood it the same way. And then there is the institutional side of this. Because it was not only the behavior of parents that made reunion difficult. In many cases, the institutions themselves were structured in ways that actively limited family contact rather than supporting it. A number of orphanage rulebooks and operational guidelines from this period, some of which have been preserved in archives, include specific language around parental visits. The rules varied from institution to institution, but the pattern that appears across multiple facilities is notable. Visits were scheduled rather than open. They were limited in frequency, sometimes to once a month, sometimes less. In some institutions, visits required advance approval. In others, they could be restricted or denied if the institution's administrators decided that a visit was not in the child's interest. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. An institution genuinely committed to temporary placement and family reunion would, logically, encourage contact between parents and children. It would see that contact as part of the pathway back to the family. Restricting visits, requiring approval, limiting frequency. These policies do not serve a reunification goal. They serve a different goal. What that goal was is not always clearly stated in the documents. But the effect of those policies was to create distance between children and their families, not to maintain closeness. This is where the explanation becomes difficult. If the arrangement was temporary, and if the intention was for children to return home, then why were so many of these institutions structured in ways that made reunion harder rather than easier? Why were the rules around family contact designed to limit rather than facilitate connection? These are not small operational details. They are structural choices that shaped outcomes. And they are choices that the temporary shelter explanation does not satisfactorily account for. There is one more element here that deserves direct attention. In some institutions, parents were required to formally surrender legal rights to their children upon admission. Not informally. Not through a vague understanding. Through an actual legal document. Parents signed away guardianship, sometimes permanently, sometimes with conditions, at the point of entry. The existence of this requirement is something that researchers have found in records across multiple institutions and multiple countries. And it raises a very direct question. If the arrangement was understood by both parties to be temporary, if the parent was simply using the institution as a short-term solution during a difficult period, then why was a formal legal surrender of parental rights part of the admission process? A temporary shelter does not typically require its users to sign away their legal relationship to what they are storing. A parent checking a child into a temporary arrangement retains their rights as a parent. The fact that some institutions required formal legal surrender at admission suggests that the arrangement was not, at least from the institution's perspective, understood to be temporary at all. It suggests that admission was, in at least some cases, intended to be more permanent than the families who signed those documents may have realized. Some researchers argue that parents were not always fully informed about what they were signing. That they were presented with documents in language they could not fully understand, under conditions of stress and urgency, without legal advice or advocacy. That the formal surrender of rights was framed to them as a procedural requirement rather than a permanent relinquishment. Whether that is accurate in specific cases is difficult to verify from the surviving records. But the possibility that it occurred is taken seriously by researchers who have examined how these admissions were conducted. That possibility, if accurate, changes the nature of the arrangement considerably. It moves it from a voluntary emergency measure, a parent making a difficult but informed choice, toward something that looks more like a process in which families were not fully in control of what was happening to them or their children. It doesn't fully make sense, when all of these details are placed side by side, to describe the orphanage system purely as a temporary shelter system. The stays were too long. The return rates were too low. The family contact was too limited. The institutional rules too often pointed away from reunion rather than toward it. And the legal requirements in some admissions suggest that permanence, not temporariness, was the actual underlying structure in at least a significant number of cases. None of this means the official explanation is entirely wrong. Poverty was real. The pressure on families was real. And some children did return home. Those facts stand. But the full picture, the one that includes the lengths of stay, the exit pathways, the visit restrictions, the legal surrenders, does not fit cleanly inside an explanation built around temporary care. Something in the structure of this system was producing outcomes that the official explanation does not account for. Whether that something was a failure of design, a misalignment of intentions, or something more deliberate is not yet clear. What is clear is that the records, when read in full, raise questions that the official version of this history has not completely answered. And those questions do not go away simply because the explanation is reasonable. They remain present in the documents, in the long stays, in the missing reunifications, in the rulebooks that limited visits, in the admission forms that required parents to sign away their rights. The records are still there, in various archives, waiting to be read in full. And what they describe, across country after country and decade after decade, is a system that looked like one thing from the outside and functioned, in many cases, as something considerably more complicated on the inside. To understand how this system developed, it helps to go back to where it began. Orphanages did not appear suddenly. They grew gradually, over a long period of time, shaped by the forces and ideas of the eras in which they expanded. And looking at that growth carefully, at who built these institutions, why they built them, and how they were presented to the public, reveals details that the straightforward humanitarian narrative tends to leave in the background. Formal institutions for dependent children existed in various forms long before the 19th century. Foundling homes, workhouses, and church-run shelters had been part of European social life for centuries. But the organized orphanage, as a recognized and widespread institution with a clear identity and a public-facing purpose, began its real period of expansion during the 1700s. Religious organizations were among the first to build them in significant numbers. Private charities followed. And by the time the 19th century arrived, with its rapid industrialization and its dramatic concentration of poor families in urban areas, the building of these facilities accelerated considerably. By the mid to late 1800s, orphanages had become a visible and accepted part of the social landscape in Britain, the United States, Ireland, Australia, and much of continental Europe. Governments that had initially left child welfare to religious and charitable organizations began to take a more direct role, funding institutions, establishing regulations, and in some cases building state-run facilities of their own. The system grew large. And as it grew, it developed its own logic, its own language, and its own way of presenting itself to the world outside its walls. The motivations behind this expansion, at least in the official record, were humanitarian. The reformers who advocated for these institutions, and there were many of them, earnest and vocal, were responding to real and visible suffering. Children living on city streets, working in dangerous conditions in factories and mines, surviving without adequate food, shelter, or education. These were genuine problems of the industrial era, and they were not small ones. Reformers saw institutional care as a solution. A place where vulnerable children could be gathered, protected, educated, and given a moral foundation that their circumstances might otherwise deny them. That framing, the institution as a place of rescue and moral improvement, was powerful. It gave orphanages a clear identity and a compelling public purpose. It made them easy to support, easy to fund, and easy to defend. And it made the people who built and ran them appear, to the public, as agents of compassion doing necessary and admirable work. But framing is not the same as reality. And this is where it becomes useful to examine the framing itself more carefully. The word orphan was central to how these institutions described themselves and their purpose. It is a word with a specific meaning, a child without living parents, a child truly alone in the world. That meaning carries emotional weight. It evokes vulnerability, innocence, and the clear moral obligation of those who have more to help those who have nothing. When an institution calls itself an orphanage and appeals to the public using the language of orphan children, it positions itself within a moral framework that is difficult to argue against. But that framing was applied to institutions where, as the records consistently show, the majority of children had at least one living parent. The word orphan was being used to describe children who were not, by the standard definition of the word, orphans at all. And that gap between the label and the reality raises a question that is surprisingly difficult to answer cleanly. Was this simply a loose use of language, reflecting a broader definition of the word that was common at the time? Or was it something more deliberate, a framing choice that served a purpose beyond mere description? Some historians argue that the broader definition of orphan was genuinely common during this period. That the word was applied to any child considered socially vulnerable or without adequate parental support, regardless of whether the parents were alive. Under that interpretation, using the orphan label for institutions that housed children with living parents was not deceptive. It was simply the vocabulary of the era. Others disagree. They point out that even within the era, the distinction between a true orphan and a child with living parents was understood and discussed. Legal documents, court records, and institutional guidelines from the period frequently drew that distinction explicitly. So the claim that no one noticed the difference, or that the difference was not meaningful, is harder to sustain than it might initially appear. That tension between the two interpretations has not been fully resolved. And it matters, because it shapes how the entire system is understood. If the orphan label was applied loosely but innocently, then the institutions were simply imprecise in their language while trying to do genuine good. If the label was applied strategically, to generate public sympathy and donor support for institutions that were housing a different population than the one described, then something more deliberate was happening. At first, it seems like a question of vocabulary. But there is a problem. Because the use of that framing had real consequences. It shaped public understanding. It generated funding. It gave institutions a moral authority that made scrutiny less likely. And it meant that the families whose children were inside these institutions, poor families, immigrant families, families without social standing or legal knowledge, had very little public voice with which to describe their own experience. The narrative about what orphanages were and who they served was controlled by the institutions and their supporters. The families rarely got to tell their own version. And then there is the detail that some researchers have noted in the early administrative records. A detail that is easy to overlook but that becomes more significant the more carefully it is considered. Many of these institutions were not simply waiting for children to arrive. They were going out and finding them. Institutional representatives, sometimes called visitors, sometimes agents, sometimes simply representatives of a particular charity or religious organization, were documented as actively visiting poor neighborhoods. They spoke with families who were struggling. They explained what the institution offered. They encouraged parents to consider placement. In some cases, they returned multiple times. In some cases, they were persistent. This is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because there is a meaningful difference between an institution that responds to families in crisis and an institution that actively seeks out children to fill its beds. The first is reactive. The second is something else. It is an institution with a recruitment function, an institution that is not simply waiting to help but is actively engaged in the process of bringing children in. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because it raises a question that the official humanitarian framing does not address directly. If an institution is going into poor neighborhoods and actively encouraging parents to place their children, parents who may not have sought that option on their own, then the arrangement is not purely demand-driven. The institution is not simply meeting a need that already exists. It is, at least in part, generating its own population. And that raises the question that sits at the center of this particular detail. Who benefited from a full institution? The humanitarian answer is simple. The children benefited. A full institution was a full institution because there were children who needed help, and the institution was providing it. Under that interpretation, recruitment was simply outreach, a way of reaching families who might not have known about the available resource. But there is another way to read the same evidence. Institutions that received funding based on the number of children they housed had a financial interest in maintaining high occupancy. A full institution was a funded institution. An empty institution had no claim on the charitable donations, government grants, and religious subsidies that kept it operational. Under this interpretation, the recruitment of children from poor neighborhoods was not purely altruistic. It was also practical. It served the institution's own operational needs. This does not require assuming that everyone involved was acting in bad faith. People can simultaneously believe in the good of what they are doing and benefit materially from doing it. The reformers of this era likely did believe they were helping children. And the institutions they built likely did provide real benefits to some of the children they housed. These things can be true at the same time as a structural incentive toward full occupancy was shaping institutional behavior in ways that were not purely humanitarian. However, the presence of that incentive is something the official history of this period tends not to examine directly. The focus remains on the stated motivations: rescue, education, moral improvement, and the structural interests that ran alongside those motivations are treated as secondary or incidental. That selectivity in the historical account is itself a detail worth noting. There is also something in the nature of who was being recruited. The families approached by institutional representatives were not random. They were poor families. Immigrant families. Families with limited legal knowledge and limited social power. Families who are unlikely to know their rights, unlikely to have access to legal advice, and unlikely to have the social standing to question the authority of a well-funded religious or charitable organization. That pattern of targeting, if it can be called that, is consistent with a system in which the families most likely to comply, and least likely to resist or challenge what happened afterward, were the families most often approached. Whether that targeting was conscious or simply the result of going where poverty was concentrated is not always clear from the records. But the outcome was the same regardless of the intent. By the end of the 19th century, the orphanage system had become large, institutionally established, and publicly respected. It had a clear identity, a sympathetic public image, and a growing network of facilities spread across multiple countries. It was, by any external measure, a successful social institution. The question that the records quietly raise is whether that success was built entirely on what it claimed to be built on, or whether the foundations included elements that the official framing was carefully designed not to highlight. That question does not have a clean answer. The records point in directions that the official explanation does not fully follow. And those directions, taken together, suggest that the early history of the orphanage system was more complicated than the humanitarian narrative that has surrounded it for most of the time since. What exactly drove that complexity, whether it was structural incentive, deliberate strategy, cultural bias, or simply the unintended consequences of a well-meaning but imperfect system, remains, in important ways, unresolved. The documents exist. The patterns are visible. But the full explanation for how they came to be is still not entirely clear. One of the clearest contradictions in this entire history is not hidden deep in obscure archives. It sits on the surface, visible to anyone who takes the time to compare two sets of documents that existed side by side within the same institutions. On one side, there are the public-facing materials, the fundraising appeals, the annual reports, the newspaper articles, the donation requests. On the other side, there are the internal records, the intake forms, the admission registers, the case notes written by staff at the moment a child arrived. When these two sets of documents are placed next to each other and read together, they do not tell the same story. That gap is one of the most consistently documented findings in the historical research on this period. And it is worth examining carefully, because it is not a small discrepancy. It is not a matter of slightly different emphasis or minor variation in detail. The two pictures, the public one and the internal one, are, in important respects, fundamentally different from each other. The public communications produced by orphanages during the 19th and early 20th centuries were remarkably consistent in how they described the children in their care. Fundraising pamphlets spoke of orphans. Annual reports counted orphans. Newspaper articles written about these institutions described the children inside as having no one, no family, no parent, no home to return to. The image presented to donors, to governments, and to the general public was of children who were truly alone in the world and who depended entirely on the institution and its supporters for their survival. That image was powerful. It was designed to be. Charitable giving in this era, as in any era, responded to emotional appeals. The figure of a child with no parents, vulnerable, innocent, entirely dependent on the goodwill of strangers, was one of the most compelling images available to any organization seeking public support. Orphanages used that image consistently, across countries, across decades, across different types of institutions, whether religious, private, or government-affiliated. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because the internal records that these same institutions kept for their own administrative purposes tell a different story entirely. When researchers have been able to access the intake records, the actual admission documents completed at the moment a child entered an institution, what they find does not match the public image. Parent names appear in the records. Not just occasionally. Regularly. Addresses are written down. Family circumstances are noted. Admission forms include fields for recording the names and whereabouts of living relatives. Case notes sometimes describe the family situation in specific terms. A father who lost work, a mother who became ill, a household that was described as temporarily unable to manage. The word temporarily appears more than once in these internal documents. It is a word that implies impermanence, a condition expected to change, a situation that has not yet resolved itself. That word, appearing in internal documents while the public materials described the same children as parentless orphans, is a detail that is difficult to set aside once it has been noticed. It suggests that the people inside these institutions, the administrators, the intake workers, the people filling out the forms, understood the situation differently from how it was being communicated to the outside world. They knew the children had parents. They recorded the parents' names and addresses. They noted that the arrangement was temporary. And then the institution's public communications described those same children as orphans with no one. At first, this seems like it could be explained as careless language. Perhaps the word orphan was used loosely, as a general category for any dependent child, without the specific intent to mislead. This is the explanation that some historians offer. They argue that the vocabulary of the era was simply imprecise, that orphan functioned as a broad social category rather than a precise legal or biological description, and that the people using the word did not necessarily intend it to create a false impression. That explanation is worth taking seriously. Language does shift over time. Categories that seem clear today were sometimes applied more loosely in earlier periods. And it is possible that at least some of the people who used the word orphan in their public communications were not consciously misrepresenting the population they served. They may simply have been using the language that was available to them, in the way that language was commonly used. But there is a problem with accepting that explanation too quickly. Because the internal records, written by the same institutions and often by the same administrators, use different language. They do not describe children as orphans in the intake forms. They record parents. They note temporary circumstances. They use vocabulary that reflects an accurate understanding of the situation. That means the people inside these institutions had access to more precise language when they chose to use it. The question is why they chose not to use it in their public communications. Some historians explain this directly as a matter of fundraising strategy. The orphan framing, they argue, was more emotionally effective than the accurate framing. A donor presented with the image of a true orphan, a child entirely alone, is more likely to give generously than a donor presented with the more complicated picture of a child whose parents are alive but struggling. The simplified version of the story produced better results. And so the simplified version was used. This explanation is plausible. It is grounded in a realistic understanding of how charitable organizations operated during this period, and it does not require assuming that every administrator was deliberately dishonest. Simplifying a complex situation for public communication is something that organizations have always done. And in an era with no formal advertising standards, no regulatory oversight of charitable claims, and no expectation of systematic transparency, the gap between public framing and internal reality may have seemed unremarkable to those who maintained it. But the explanation is also uncomfortable. And it is worth sitting with that discomfort for a moment before moving past it. Because what this explanation describes, when stated plainly, is an organized system of public communication that consistently presented an inaccurate picture of itself. Not accidentally, not through careless language alone, but as a deliberate strategy, one that was maintained across multiple institutions, multiple countries, and multiple decades. The inaccuracy served a purpose. It generated donations. It secured public sympathy. It insulated the institutions from scrutiny by wrapping them in a moral framing that was difficult to challenge. That is not a trivial observation. It means that the public understanding of what orphanages were, who they served, and what their relationship was to the children inside them was shaped, in significant part, by communications that the institutions themselves knew to be incomplete at best. The people who gave money to these organizations were giving based on a picture that did not fully reflect the reality. The governments that supported them, the newspapers that praised them, the communities that respected them, all were responding to a framing that the institutions had constructed and maintained, and that their own internal records did not support. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken. Because once it becomes clear that the public framing was deliberately simplified, that the institutions knew the full picture and chose to present a different one, a reasonable question follows. If this particular element of the official story was oversimplified, what else might have been handled the same way? The fundraising explanation accounts for the gap between public language and internal records. But it does not fully explain what that gap meant for the families involved. Parents whose children were inside these institutions were not donors. They were not members of the public being asked to give money. They were the people most directly affected by the system's decisions. And the question of what those parents were told, about their rights, about the permanence of the arrangement, about what would happen to their children, is a question that the fundraising explanation does not address. If an institution was willing to present an inaccurate picture to donors for strategic reasons, then the question of what it was willing to tell struggling parents, people with even less power and even less ability to seek independent verification, becomes more pressing. Not as an accusation, but as a logical extension of what the evidence already shows. A system comfortable with one form of strategic communication may have been comfortable with others. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because it introduces a doubt that applies not just to the public framing but to the entire account these institutions offered of themselves and their operations. Once the gap between public and internal records is established, once it is clear that the two did not match, and that this mismatch was maintained over a long period of time, the reliability of the official account becomes a genuine question. Researchers who have worked with these archives describe the experience of reading these two sets of documents side by side as clarifying. Not in the sense of resolving the questions, but in the sense of making the questions more precise. The gap is there. It is documented. It is consistent. And it suggests that the history of the orphanage system cannot be accurately reconstructed from public-facing materials alone. Those materials were produced with an audience in mind, and they were shaped accordingly. The internal records tell something closer to the operational reality. But they are also incomplete. They record what was written down. They do not record what was said aloud, what was implied, what was left out of conversations between institutional representatives and the families they dealt with. And that layer, the unrecorded layer of what was actually communicated in those moments of admission, of signing, of handing over a child, is a layer that the surviving documents cannot fully reconstruct. What remains, then, is a documented contradiction between two types of records, an explanation for that contradiction that is plausible but uncomfortable, and a set of questions that the explanation raises without answering. Was the simplified public framing limited to fundraising materials, or did it extend into how the institutions communicated with the families directly involved? Were parents given the same carefully constructed image that donors received, or something different? And if the institutions were strategic about what they communicated and to whom, what does that suggest about the other decisions they made? These questions do not have fully verified answers. The records that would answer them most directly are often the ones least likely to have survived. What has survived is the gap itself, visible, consistent, and present across enough institutions and enough decades to make it impossible to treat as an accident or an anomaly. The gap between what was said publicly and what was recorded privately is one of the clearest and most well-documented features of this history. And it is one of the details that makes the official account of the orphanage system most difficult to accept without reservation. There is a category of evidence in this history that researchers find genuinely difficult to place within the official explanation. It does not fit neatly into the poverty narrative. It does not align cleanly with the humanitarian framing. And it does not disappear when the official account is applied to it. This category of evidence involves something specific and concrete: the economic relationship between orphanages and the children they housed. Not the stated purpose of that relationship. The actual financial structure that governed how these institutions operated and how they received their funding. Understanding that structure requires a brief look at how orphanages were funded during the 19th and early 20th centuries. These institutions did not operate without resources. Buildings had to be maintained. Staff had to be paid. Food, clothing, and basic supplies had to be provided. All of that required money. And that money came from a combination of sources: government grants in some regions, subsidies from religious organizations in others, and charitable donations from members of the public who believed in the institution's stated mission. The specific mix of funding varied by country, by region, and by the type of institution involved. But one feature of the funding structure appeared with enough consistency across different systems to be worth examining closely. In many countries and across many decades, the amount of funding an institution received was tied directly to the number of children it held. Government grants were calculated on a per-child basis. Religious subsidies were distributed according to occupancy. Charitable donations, while not always formally calculated per child, were solicited using numbers: how many children the institution currently housed, how many more it could serve with additional support. The basic principle was consistent. More children in the institution meant more funding flowing into it. Fewer children meant less. An empty institution, or a half-empty one, received proportionally less support than one operating at full capacity. This is the structural incentive that historians rarely discuss openly. And it is worth being precise about what that incentive means in practice. An incentive does not determine behavior. It shapes it. It creates conditions in which certain actions are financially rewarding and others are not. When the financial reward for an institution is tied directly to how many children it houses, the institution has a concrete material interest in maintaining high occupancy. That interest exists regardless of the intentions of the people running the institution. It exists regardless of whether those people are sincere in their humanitarian beliefs. The structure itself creates the pressure. And structures that create consistent pressure tend to produce consistent patterns of behavior, whether or not those patterns are consciously chosen. At first, it seems like this might not matter very much. If institutions needed children to survive financially, and if there were genuinely large numbers of children in need of care, then the incentive and the humanitarian purpose would point in the same direction. Filling the institution with children who needed help would simultaneously serve the mission and secure the funding. The two goals would reinforce each other, and the financial incentive would be invisible because it would always be operating alongside genuine need. But there is a problem. And it becomes visible when you ask what happens when the two goals stop pointing in the same direction. What happens when a family's situation improves and a parent wants to reclaim their child? What happens when a child no longer needs institutional care? When the crisis that prompted admission has passed and reunification is possible? In a system where funding is tied to occupancy, returning a child to their family has a financial cost. It reduces the institution's headcount. It reduces the funding that headcount generates. It creates an empty bed that, under the funding structure, is worth less than a full one. This does not mean that institutions systematically refused to return children for financial reasons. That would be a strong claim, and the evidence does not support making it as a general statement. But it does mean that the financial structure created a situation in which the institution's interests and the family's interests were not perfectly aligned. In a genuinely temporary shelter system, the institution's success would be measured partly by how many children it successfully returned to their families. In a per-child funding system, successful reunification produces no financial reward. It simply reduces the count. That misalignment is a structural feature of how these institutions were funded. And it raises questions that the official humanitarian narrative does not address. The populations most likely to place children in these institutions were, by definition, the populations with the least power to navigate that misalignment. Poor families. Immigrant families. Families without legal knowledge, without social connections, without the resources to seek independent advice or challenge institutional decisions. These were families who had placed their children in circumstances of trust and relative powerlessness. They relied on the institution to behave consistently with its stated purpose. They had limited means of verifying whether it was doing so. And they had limited recourse if it was not. Some records from this period suggest that in certain regions and in certain institutions, the admission process for children from these families raised concerns that have only been recognized clearly in retrospect. Documents signed at the point of admission were sometimes complex legal instruments that transferred significant authority over the child to the institution. Parents signing these documents, often under conditions of stress, often without access to legal counsel, sometimes in a language that was not their own, may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to. This is not a speculative claim. It is something that later investigations, formal inquiries, and government reviews in multiple countries have acknowledged explicitly. The question of informed consent, whether parents genuinely understood the nature and potential permanence of what they were signing, is one that the historical record does not resolve clearly in all cases. In some admissions, the process appears to have been reasonably transparent. In others, the record suggests something less than full understanding on the part of the family. What is consistent across many cases is that the institution held more information, more legal knowledge, and more structural power than the family. And that imbalance shaped how admission documents were presented, signed, and later interpreted. However, the timeline does not fully match the picture of a system that was careful about ensuring families understood what they were agreeing to. In many documented cases, the speed of admission, the time between a family's first contact with an institution and the moment a child was formally placed, was short. Sometimes very short. The conditions under which decisions were made were often the conditions of active crisis. A parent facing an immediate emergency does not have the mental or emotional space to carefully evaluate the long-term legal implications of an admission document. And institutions that processed large numbers of admissions under these conditions were not systematically slowing that process down to ensure informed understanding. There is also the question of what happened after admission, and whether the terms discussed at the point of entry were consistently honored as circumstances changed. Some records show instances where parents returned to an institution after their situation had stabilized, expecting to reclaim their child, and encountered unexpected obstacles. Administrative requirements. Conditions that had not been mentioned at admission. Delays without clear explanation. These individual cases are documented, though not uniformly, and they do not on their own prove a systematic pattern. But they appear often enough across different institutions and different countries to be noticed. A system that profits from full beds has reasons to keep beds full. That observation does not require assuming deliberate malice. Systems do not need malicious actors to produce problematic outcomes. They need only structural incentives that point consistently in a particular direction, combined with populations that lack the power to resist the pressure those incentives create. Both of those conditions were present in the orphanage funding system. The incentive toward full occupancy existed in the funding structure. The population with limited power to push back existed in the families who placed their children. What that combination produced, in specific cases and specific institutions, varied. Some institutions operated in ways that were genuinely consistent with their humanitarian stated purpose, despite the structural incentive working against it. Others did not. And the historical record does not yet have a full accounting of the distribution between those two categories. How many institutions maintained their stated commitments, and how many allowed the financial incentive to shape their behavior in ways that harmed families? That accounting is incomplete for a practical reason. The records are incomplete. Many institutions did not preserve detailed documentation of cases where reunification was delayed, refused, or simply never pursued. The families most affected by these outcomes were the families least likely to have left written records of their experience. And the institutional records that do survive were produced by the institutions themselves, with all the selectivity that implies. This is where the evidence sits. It does not prove systematic exploitation. But it does not support a clean dismissal of the concern either. The structural incentive was real. The power imbalance was real. The cases where admission processes raised legitimate concerns are documented. And the pattern of outcomes, the long stays, the low rates of return, the obstacles some parents encountered when trying to reclaim their children, is consistent with what a per-child funding system, operating on populations with limited power, would be expected to produce. Some researchers look at this evidence and conclude that the orphanage system, whatever its stated intentions, functioned in ways that systematically disadvantaged the families it claimed to serve. Others argue that this interpretation overstates the case, that structural incentives do not prove outcomes, and that the evidence of good faith within many institutions is also real and documented. Both positions have some support in the historical record. And the honest answer is that the full picture has not yet been assembled with enough completeness to definitively resolve the question. What is clear is that the funding structure created conditions in which the institution's financial interests and the family's interests did not consistently align. And in a system operating at scale, across decades, in multiple countries, with populations that had limited ability to protect themselves, that misalignment matters. It is not a detail that can be set aside in favor of the simpler humanitarian narrative. The evidence that doesn't fully fit is still there, in the funding records, in the admission documents, in the accounts of families who tried to navigate a system that held more power than they did. It does not resolve into a clean conclusion. But it does raise questions that the official account of this history has not yet fully answered. And those questions, like the records that generate them, remain open. When researchers examine orphanage records across different countries and different time periods, something becomes apparent that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Certain patterns appear again and again. Not in one institution, not in one country, not in one decade, but across a wide enough range of places and periods that their consistency becomes a feature of the historical record rather than an exception to it. Patterns that repeat across independent systems, separated by geography and time, usually reflect something structural. They usually point to something built into the design of a system rather than the isolated behavior of particular individuals within it. 3 of these patterns are especially well documented. Each one, when examined on its own, might be explained in terms that fit within the official humanitarian narrative. Each one has a surface-level account that sounds reasonable. But when all 3 are examined together, and when their consistent recurrence across very different contexts is considered, the surface-level accounts start to feel insufficient. The patterns begin to raise questions that the individual explanations do not fully answer. The first pattern involves immigrant families. In the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, children from recently arrived immigrant families appear in orphanage records at rates that are disproportionate to their share of the population. This is not a marginal statistical difference. Researchers who have worked with these records describe the overrepresentation as significant and consistent. Families who had recently arrived from Ireland, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from various other countries. Families in the early stages of establishing themselves in a new country, often with limited English, limited familiarity with local legal systems, and limited social networks, place their children in institutions at notably higher rates than native-born families in comparable economic situations. That comparison matters. The economic circumstances of immigrant families during this period were often difficult. But they were not uniformly more difficult than the circumstances of native-born poor families in the same cities. Poverty was widespread among both groups. What distinguished the immigrant families was not necessarily a greater degree of economic hardship. What distinguished them was unfamiliarity with the institutions, with the legal language of admission documents, with the rights they held as parents, and with the processes available to them if they wanted to challenge an institutional decision. Some researchers suggest that this vulnerability was noticed. That institutional representatives who visited poor neighborhoods were more likely to approach immigrant families, more likely to encourage placement, and more likely to successfully complete an admission with immigrant parents than with native-born parents who might be more familiar with what they were agreeing to. This suggestion is not universally accepted among historians. Others argue that the overrepresentation of immigrant children reflects genuine need rather than targeting, that immigrant families faced particular instabilities during the settlement period that made institutional care a practical necessity at higher rates. Both positions are held by serious researchers. The evidence does not fully resolve the question in either direction. But the pattern itself, the consistent overrepresentation of immigrant children, is documented well enough that it cannot simply be acknowledged and moved past. It sits in the record and continues to raise the question of why it existed and what it reflects about how the system operated. The second pattern is in some ways more concrete, because it involves a contradiction between what was said at the point of admission and what actually happened afterward. Children admitted as temporary cases, children whose intake records specifically noted that the placement was expected to be short-term, that the family intended to reunite, that the circumstances were described as temporary, frequently ended up staying far longer than the language of their admission suggested. This pattern appears across institutions in multiple countries. It is not a single institution mishandling a small number of cases. It is a recurring feature of how the temporary admission model functioned in practice, as opposed to how it was described in theory. The gap between the described intention and the actual outcome was, in many documented cases, substantial. Months became years. Years sometimes became the entire duration of a child's time within the institution, ending not in return to the family but in some other form of exit. Part of the explanation lies in the informal nature of many admission agreements. The understanding between a parent and an institution, that the placement was temporary, that the child would return home when circumstances improved, was frequently not a formal legal agreement. It was a conversation, a verbal assurance, an informal mutual understanding that existed in practice but had no binding legal standing. When a parent returned seeking their child, they often had no written document that recorded what had been agreed. The institution had the child, the institutional records, and the legal authority that formal admission processes had transferred to it. The parent had the memory of a conversation. That imbalance, between what was understood informally and what was enforceable legally, is something that some researchers describe as a systematic feature of how admissions were structured. Whether that structure was designed with this outcome in mind, or whether it simply reflected the informal administrative practices of the era, is not always clear from the surviving records. But the outcome was consistent. When informal agreements met institutional legal authority, the informal agreements frequently did not prevail. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because a system genuinely designed around temporary placement would be expected to produce formal, enforceable agreements that protected the family's right to reunification. The absence of such agreements in a large proportion of cases is a feature that serves the institution's interests more than the family's. Whether it was designed that way or simply tolerated that way, the effect was the same. The third pattern is perhaps the one that most clearly challenges the temporary shelter explanation. It involves what happened to children when they eventually left these institutions. If orphanages functioned as temporary shelters, places where children waited until their families recovered, then the most common exit from these institutions should have been returned to the family. That is what a temporary system, operating as described, would produce. Children going home. But the records show that a substantial number of children left these institutions through other means entirely. They were placed into domestic service, working in the households of other families, often at young ages, in arrangements that were sometimes described as charitable placements and sometimes as formalized labor. They were sent to farms, particularly in certain regions of the United States, Canada, and Australia, through organized placement programs that moved children significant distances from their places of origin. They were apprenticed to tradespeople or craftsmen. They were transferred to other institutions in different cities or different countries. In some documented programs, children were placed on trains and transported across large distances to be settled with families or into work arrangements in regions they had never been to, far from any remaining connection to their own family of origin. These exit pathways were not marginal. In some institutions and some periods, they represented the primary way children left. More children left through labor placement or distant resettlement than through return to their families. That is a significant finding. And it sits in direct tension with the temporary shelter explanation, which predicts the opposite outcome. At first, each of these three patterns might seem to have an innocent explanation. Immigrant families faced particular vulnerabilities during the settlement period. That could explain their overrepresentation without implying targeting. Temporary placements extended because family situations did not recover as quickly as hoped. That could explain long stays without implying institutional bad faith. Labor placements and farm settlements were understood at the time as positive outcomes, giving children opportunities they might not otherwise have had. That could explain the exit pathways without implying exploitation. These explanations are all available. They are all used, in various forms, by historians who interpret this evidence charitably. And none of them can be completely ruled out in specific cases. But there is a problem. The patterns do not appear in isolation. They appear together. In the same institutions, in the same periods, across the same populations. Immigrant children overrepresented in admissions. Temporary placements becoming permanent. Children exiting not to their families but to labor arrangements far from home. When three patterns that each have an innocent individual explanation consistently appear together, the question of whether their co-occurrence is also innocent becomes harder to dismiss. A system genuinely organized around temporary care and family reunion would not be expected to produce all three of these patterns simultaneously and consistently. It might produce one, in some circumstances. It might produce two, in unusual periods. But all three, together, across multiple countries and multiple decades, suggests that the system was producing something other than what its stated purpose described. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that these were simply accidental outcomes of a well-intentioned system that struggled to achieve its goals. Some of the exit pathways, particularly the organized programs that moved children to distant farms and households, were not improvised responses to difficult circumstances. They were organized programs, run deliberately, with their own administrative structures and their own networks of placement agents. They were not accidents. They were designed. That raises the question of what they were designed to achieve. The official answer, offered at the time and repeated in sympathetic historical accounts since, is that they were designed to give children better opportunities. To move them out of urban poverty and into environments where they could learn a trade, develop discipline, and build a future. That framing was used consistently by the organizations that ran these programs. But the framing does not address what happened to the families left behind. It does not address whether parents consented to their children being moved hundreds of miles away. It does not address whether the children who were placed in these arrangements experienced them as opportunities or as something considerably harder. And it does not address why the primary beneficiaries of these programs were consistently children from the most vulnerable and least powerful families in the population. Those questions sit alongside the patterns. They do not resolve them. They extend them. And they point toward a dimension of this history that the standard account, children helped by charitable institutions during a period of industrial hardship, has consistently underemphasized. What the patterns together suggest is that the orphanage system, whatever its stated purpose, consistently produced outcomes that served interests other than those of the families whose children entered it. Whether that was by design, by structural incentive, or by the accumulated effect of thousands of individual decisions made within a system that was never adequately scrutinized, that question does not yet have a definitive answer. What is clear is that the patterns are there, documented, consistent, and spread across enough of the historical record to be taken seriously. Each one individually might be explained away. Together, they are considerably harder to dismiss. And together, they continue to raise the question that the official account of this history has never fully resolved, whether the orphanage system was functioning as it described itself, or whether it was functioning as something else, operating under the same name. Once researchers began examining these patterns more closely, the scale of what they found was not what most of them had initially anticipated. When this history is discussed in general terms, it tends to be framed as a collection of unfortunate episodes, difficult moments in the past, products of their time, cases where well-meaning systems fell short of their stated ideals. That framing implies a certain size. It implies something manageable, something that can be understood as a series of isolated failures spread across a long period of history. But the actual scale, as investigations in multiple countries have revealed, is considerably larger than that framing suggests. This was not a local problem. It was not a phenomenon limited to a particular country, a particular religious organization, or a particular type of institution. The placement of children with living parents into orphanages and similar institutions was, by the account of multiple independent historical investigations, a widespread and structurally embedded practice across the industrialized world. It was not an exception to how the system worked. In many places and many periods, it was how the system worked. Understanding that scale requires looking at specific countries and specific investigations. Because the scale becomes real not in general statements but in the numbers that formal inquiries have placed on record. In Australia, historical investigations that began in the latter decades of the 20th century and continued into the 21st revealed findings that the country had not previously confronted in a systematic way. Tens of thousands of children, many of them with living relatives, many of them from families that had not clearly or freely consented to placement, had been placed into institutional care during the 19th and 20th centuries. The investigations found that in a significant proportion of these cases, the families involved had not been given accurate information about what institutional placement would mean for their rights, their children's futures, or their ability to maintain contact and eventually reunite. The numbers involved were large enough that the findings could not be attributed to the failure of individual institutions acting outside the norms of the broader system. The scale itself implied that the system as a whole had been operating in ways that its stated purpose did not describe. Similar investigations in Canada uncovered comparable findings. Indigenous children appear in the Canadian record in particularly large numbers, though the institutional care system affected a much broader population than Indigenous communities alone. Families across different backgrounds and different regions had placed children, or had children taken, under circumstances that subsequent investigations described as inadequate in terms of consent, transparency, and the protection of family rights. The scale of what was documented in Canada, as in Australia, was large enough to prompt formal government responses. In Ireland, investigations into the institutional care system revealed a record that was, in several respects, among the most extensively documented in any country. Church-run institutions had operated across the country for generations, housing large numbers of children whose family situations were more complex than the institution's public presentations had suggested. Government inquiries established that the conditions inside many of these institutions were far removed from the humanitarian ideals that had been used to justify their existence. And the scale, the sheer number of children who had passed through these institutions over the relevant decades, was established clearly enough to make it impossible to treat what had occurred as the work of a few aberrant institutions operating outside the system's norms. In the United Kingdom, investigations and public inquiries covering residential care institutions across different periods produced findings that added further detail to the same broad picture. Children placed into institutional care, sometimes far from their families, sometimes under circumstances where the consent of parents was incomplete or the information provided was misleading. The numbers documented across these investigations were, again, not the numbers of isolated incidents. They were the numbers of a pattern. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the scale of what the investigations found in each of these countries does not fully match the way this history had been discussed prior to those investigations. For most of the time during which these systems were operating, and for much of the period immediately following their decline, the public understanding was shaped by the framing the institutions themselves had established. The charitable rescue narrative. The humanitarian mission. The necessary response to poverty and social instability. That framing occupied the space where more critical examination might otherwise have occurred. And as a result, the actual scale of what had happened was not recognized, at least not in official, public terms, until the investigations that came later. That delay is itself something worth examining. These systems operated for decades. They affected enormous numbers of children and families. They were funded by governments, supported by churches, and celebrated in public discourse as examples of social progress. And yet the systematic examination of what they had actually produced, the investigations that would eventually lead to formal acknowledgements and national apologies, did not occur until long after the systems had largely wound down. In some cases, The gap between when the practices occurred and when they were formally examined and acknowledged stretched to a century or more. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because the delay in formal recognition is not simply a matter of historical timing. It reflects something about how much scrutiny these institutions received while they were operating. And the answer, in most countries, is that the scrutiny was limited. The moral authority of the humanitarian framing, the social respectability of the religious and charitable organizations involved, and the powerlessness of the families most affected all contributed to a situation in which the systems operated for extended periods without serious independent examination of whether they were doing what they claimed to be doing. Some of these investigations, once they were eventually conducted, led to outcomes that had not previously been part of the public conversation about this history. Formal national apologies. Government acknowledgements that children had been separated from families under circumstances that did not meet the standard of genuine informed consent. Official recognition that what had occurred was not simply the imperfect execution of a good faith system but something that required formal acknowledgement of harm and, in some cases, commitments to redress. These apologies were significant. They represented a formal departure from the charitable framing that had surrounded these institutions for so long. They acknowledged, in official governmental language, that families had been misled, that consent had been inadequate, that the scale of separation had been larger than the public record had reflected. They put on record, in terms that governments were willing to state officially, that what had happened was not simply an unfortunate product of difficult times. But the apologies also raised a further question. And it is a question that the apologies themselves, by their nature, do not answer. If the scale was large enough to require formal state apologies, if the number of children affected, and the number of families who had not truly consented, was large enough to prompt governments to make official acknowledgements of institutional harm, then the events being apologized for were not the actions of a few isolated institutions behaving outside the norms of their system. Individual institutions behaving badly do not generate the kind of scale that produces national apologies. They generate local scandals, institutional reforms, perhaps some individual accountability. They do not generate the kind of systematic, countrywide pattern that requires a government to formally acknowledge, decades later, that something went fundamentally wrong at a structural level. The scale implies the system. That is the logical conclusion that the apologies, by their very existence, point toward. If the problem had been local, the apologies would have been local. If the problem had been the behavior of a few bad actors within an otherwise sound system, the response would have been to identify those actors and reform the relevant institutions. But the apologies that were made were not targeted at specific institutions or specific individuals. They were addressed to entire categories of affected families. They acknowledged patterns, not incidents. And patterns, in a system that operated across an entire country for multiple generations, reflect the system rather than exceptions to it. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because acknowledging that the pattern was systemic raises a question that is harder to answer than the question of whether harm occurred. The question of whether harm occurred has been answered, in formal terms, by the governments that issued the apologies. The harder question is how a system that was publicly framed as humanitarian, that was supported by governments and religious institutions, that was celebrated in its time as a form of social progress, how that system produced outcomes at a scale large enough to require formal national acknowledgement of harm. Some researchers argue that the answer lies in structural incentives, in the funding models, the legal frameworks, and the power imbalances that shaped how the system actually operated regardless of stated intentions. Others argue that the answer lies in the ideology of the era, in beliefs about poverty, about class, about the fitness of certain families to raise children, beliefs that were widely held and that shaped institutional behavior in ways that the people involved did not recognize as harmful. Others still argue that the two explanations are not in competition, that structural incentives and ideological assumptions operated together, reinforcing each other within a system that was never adequately scrutinized from the outside. However, the timeline does not fully match any single explanation on its own. The practices documented in these investigations did not emerge suddenly or disappear quickly. They developed over time, persisted over time, and changed over time in response to forces that are not yet fully mapped in the historical literature. That persistence, across changing governments, changing religious leadership, changing social attitudes, suggests that whatever was driving the system was not easily dislodged by the kinds of surface-level changes that occurred during the relevant period. What the scale makes clear is that this history cannot be adequately understood as a collection of unfortunate episodes. The numbers are too large. The geographic range is too wide. The formal acknowledgements are too explicit. What the investigations found, across multiple countries and multiple decades of institutional practice, is a pattern that was embedded in the structure of a system that operated under the name of child welfare while producing outcomes that, in formal governmental terms, required apology. Whether that system was a welfare system that made serious and repeated mistakes, or whether it was something else operating under the name of welfare, is a question that the scale itself forces into view. It is a question the apologies acknowledged without fully answering. And it remains, in important respects, a question that the historical record has not yet completely resolved. The scale is established. The harm is acknowledged. The explanation for how it happened at that scale, within a system publicly committed to child welfare, is still not as clear as the numbers that the investigations placed on record. Not everyone who studies this history arrives at the same place. That is worth stating clearly, because when a topic involves harm at the scale that the orphanage system produced, there can be a tendency to assume that the conclusions are settled, that the evidence points in one direction and that the interpretation of that evidence is agreed upon. But that is not the situation here. Among the scholars, researchers, and historians who have spent serious time working with these records, there are genuine and substantive disagreements. Not about whether the records exist, and not about whether harm occurred. Those things are established. The disagreements are about something harder to resolve, about how to interpret what the records show, about what drove the system to produce the outcomes it produced, and about what kind of historical account most accurately describes what happened and why. These disagreements are not minor variations in emphasis. They reflect genuinely different frameworks for understanding the same body of evidence. And because the evidence is complex, and because the system it documents was large and operated across a long period of time in many different contexts, more than one framework can find support in the record. That is part of what makes this history difficult to close off with a single explanation. The first major school of thought is the one that is perhaps most commonly encountered in mainstream historical accounts of this period. It holds that the orphanage system, while deeply flawed in its outcomes, was not deliberately exploitative in its design or its intentions. The reformers who built and ran these institutions, according to this perspective, were genuine in their belief that they were helping. They lived in a world defined by visible poverty, by children working in dangerous conditions, by families struggling in ways that were real and serious. They responded to what they saw by building institutions they believed would provide something better. Under this interpretation, the harm that resulted was not the product of malicious design. It was the product of misguided belief. Reformers of the era held assumptions about poverty, about family capacity, about the moral and educational needs of children from lower social classes, that are recognizable today as deeply flawed. They believed that institutional structure, religious guidance, and removal from the conditions of poverty could produce outcomes that the family home, particularly the poor family home, could not. Those beliefs were wrong in ways that caused serious harm. But the people who held them were not, in this view, deliberately seeking to harm the families they separated or the children they removed. They believed in what they were doing. The harm was real, but it emerged from conviction rather than cruelty. This interpretation has significant support among historians who work within a framework that emphasizes understanding historical actors within the context of their own time. It argues against applying contemporary moral standards retroactively to people who operated within a genuinely different set of assumptions. And it points to documented evidence of sincere humanitarian motivation. Reformers who wrote passionately about child welfare, who sacrificed personally for the institutions they ran, who appear in the record as genuinely committed to the children in their care. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because sincerity of belief does not fully account for several features of the record that have already been examined. The gap between public communications and internal documents was not the product of misguided belief, it was a strategic choice about what information to present to whom. The per-child funding structures were not accidental. They were designed and maintained over long periods by people who understood their implications. The legal frameworks that made reunion difficult were not the byproduct of good intentions. They were specific structural choices that served institutional interests at the expense of family rights. These features of the system do not fit comfortably within an account that attributes everything to sincere but misguided belief. The second major perspective takes a more critical position. Some researchers argue that the charitable framing of the orphanage system has functioned, historically, as a kind of cover, not necessarily a conscious one in every case, but a cover nonetheless, for something that served interests beyond the welfare of the children involved. Under this interpretation, the orphanage system functioned as a mechanism of social control. A way for dominant social classes, established religious institutions, and governments to reshape the children of poor and immigrant families according to particular cultural, religious, and economic ideals. Under this reading, the separation from family was not an unfortunate side effect of a system trying to help. It was, in significant ways, the point. The children of poor families, left with their families, would be raised within the values, languages, traditions, and social identities of those families. Placed in institutions, they could be shaped differently. They could be educated in particular religious traditions. They could be trained for particular kinds of labor. They could be moved away from immigrant cultural identities and toward the dominant cultural norms of the societies in which the institutions operated. The institution, under this interpretation, was not primarily a shelter. It was a site of transformation. This perspective is supported by evidence that is genuinely present in the record. The curricula of many orphanages were explicitly designed to instill particular religious and cultural values. The labor placements that many children were directed into were consistent with the social positions that the dominant culture had assigned to the lower classes. The disproportionate placement of immigrant children, and the consistent movement of those children away from their cultural communities of origin, is consistent with an agenda of cultural assimilation, whether or not that agenda was always consciously articulated. However, this interpretation also has limits. It tends to imply a degree of coordination and intentionality that the evidence does not always support. The orphanage system was not a single unified project. It was a loosely connected collection of institutions run by different organizations with different motivations in different countries over different periods. Attributing a single coherent agenda to that collection requires a level of centralized intent that the historical record does not consistently demonstrate. Some researchers who are broadly sympathetic to the social control interpretation acknowledge this limitation and argue for a more structural version of the argument. One that does not require conscious coordination but simply notes that the system consistently served certain interests over others. The third major perspective is the one that focuses primarily on structure rather than intent. This framework argues that the question of whether individual actors meant well or meant harm is, in important respects, secondary. What matters, under this interpretation, is what the system's structure produced. And the structure of the orphanage system, its funding models, its legal frameworks, its admission processes, its power relationships, created conditions in which harm was not simply possible but, for large numbers of families, close to inevitable. A per-child funding system creates pressure toward full occupancy regardless of the intentions of the people operating within it. Legal frameworks that transferred authority to institutions without providing families with enforceable rights of return created structural disadvantage for families regardless of whether administrators were acting in good faith. Power imbalances between well-resourced institutions and poor, immigrant, legally unsophisticated families created conditions in which families could not effectively advocate for themselves regardless of whether the people they were dealing with wished them well. Under this interpretation, the intentions of individual actors are almost beside the point. The structure was going to produce these outcomes with sincere humanitarians running it just as surely as it would have with people of worse intentions. The problem was not in the hearts of the reformers. It was in the design of the system they built and maintained. This perspective has considerable explanatory power. It accounts for the consistency of the patterns across very different institutional contexts. It explains why the same types of outcomes appeared in institutions run by different religious organizations, in different countries, during different political periods. Structure transcends individual variation. A system with the same structural features will tend to produce the same structural outcomes regardless of who is operating it at any given moment. But there is a problem with treating any single one of these three interpretations as fully sufficient on its own. Each of them accounts for part of the evidence. None of them accounts for all of it. The misguided belief interpretation explains the sincerity of many reformers but struggles with the strategic elements of how the system presented itself. The social control interpretation explains the cultural and ideological dimensions of the system's outcomes, but tends to overstate the degree of unified intentionality in what was a diverse and loosely connected set of institutions. The structural interpretation explains the consistency of outcomes but can understate the role that deliberate choices about how to write admission documents, how to structure funding applications, how to frame public communications, played in creating and maintaining the structure. Some researchers, working across these different frameworks, have suggested that the most accurate account of this history is one that holds elements of all three interpretations simultaneously. That the system was built by people who were largely sincere in their stated intentions, and that it was also shaped by ideological assumptions about class and culture that served particular social interests, and that it was also structured in ways that made harmful outcomes nearly inevitable regardless of individual intent. These three things are not mutually exclusive. They describe different dimensions of the same system, operating at the same time, producing the same outcomes. Others disagree. They argue that combining interpretations in this way produces an account that is too diffuse, one that explains everything in general and nothing in particular. They argue for prioritizing one framework over the others and building the historical account from that foundation. That disagreement among researchers has not been resolved. There is not yet a consensus interpretation of this history that commands broad agreement across the relevant scholarly fields. The evidence is established. The harm is acknowledged. The scale is documented. But the explanation, the account of why the system worked the way it did, what drove its outcomes, and whose interests it ultimately served, remains genuinely contested. What is not contested is that the simple narrative, charitable institutions rescuing orphaned children from poverty, staffed by compassionate reformers doing necessary work, does not account for everything the records show. That narrative was the one the system produced about itself. And as with the gap between public communications and internal records, the gap between that narrative and the fuller picture is visible, documented, and difficult to close. The records that survive, the intake forms, the funding documents, the admission registers, the exit records, the correspondence between institutions and placement agents, describe something more complicated than the narrative of charitable rescue. What exactly that something is remains a question that different researchers answer differently. And the fact that serious, careful historians who have spent years working with this evidence still disagree about the answer suggests that the question itself is genuinely difficult. Not unanswerable, perhaps, but not yet answered in a way that has produced agreement. And that uncertainty, sitting alongside the documented scale of what occurred, is itself one of the most significant features of this history. After examining the numbers, the records, the patterns, and the competing explanations, a particular kind of clarity emerges. Not the clarity of resolution. Not the clarity that comes from finding a final answer at the end of a long investigation. It is a different kind, the clarity of understanding precisely what remains unknown and why it remains that way. Some questions, after enough examination, stop feeling like temporary gaps in the record. They start to feel like permanent features of it. And the questions surrounding the orphanage system have, for many researchers who have worked with this history seriously, reached exactly that point. The questions themselves are not difficult to state. They have been present throughout this investigation, returning in different forms at different points. Why did a system named for orphans primarily house children who were not orphans? That is the question that opened this history, and it has not been fully closed. The various explanations offered, poverty, loose definitions, the temporary shelter model, the fundraising value of the orphan label, each account for part of the pattern. None of them accounts for all of it, across all the countries, all the decades, and all the institutional contexts in which the same basic feature appeared. Why did so many of these institutions make reunion with living parents structurally difficult? If the system was designed around temporary placement and eventual family reunification, Its structural features should have reflected that design. The records show that in many institutions they did not. Visit restrictions, legal surrenders of parental rights at admission, informal agreements with no enforceable standing, exit pathways that led away from family rather than back to it. These are structural features that point away from the stated purpose of the system, not toward it. The gap between what the system said it was designed to do and what its structures were actually set up to produce is one of the clearest and most consistent findings in the historical record. And why did the public language used by these organizations consistently describe a situation that their own internal records did not reflect? The gap between public communications and internal documents is documented. It was not a minor discrepancy in wording. It was a sustained and consistent difference between two pictures of the same institutions. One presented to the outside world, one maintained in the administrative record. The fundraising explanation accounts for the motivation behind that gap. It does not fully account for its extent, its consistency, or what it implies about the reliability of the rest of the official account. These three questions sit at the center of this history. And they are related. Each one points toward the same underlying uncertainty about whether the orphanage system was what it said it was, or whether it was something operating beneath that description, using the language and moral authority of child welfare to pursue outcomes that the public framing did not openly acknowledge. At first, it seems like this uncertainty should be resolvable. The system operated across long periods of time, across many countries, and left behind a significant body of documentation. Surely enough evidence exists to produce a clear answer. But this is where the nature of the surviving record becomes part of the problem itself. The records are incomplete. That is not a minor qualification. It is a central feature of this historical problem. Many documents that would help answer the key questions were never created in the first place. The conversations that took place at the moment of admission, the actual words exchanged between institutional representatives and parents handing over their children, were not recorded. The informal agreements, the verbal reassurances, the specific claims made about what placement would involve and what rights parents would retain, these exist, if at all, only in the memories of people who are no longer living. Many documents that were created did not survive. Institutional archives from the 19th and early 20th centuries are patchy. Records were lost when institutions closed. They were damaged over time. They were destroyed, in some cases deliberately, and in other cases simply through neglect. The absence of records is not neutral. It shapes what questions can be answered and which must remain open. And the pattern of what survived tends to favor the institution's own preferred accounts over the accounts of the families most affected. The children who passed through these institutions had essentially no power to document their own experiences during the relevant periods. They were children, in most cases from poor and marginalized families, with no access to the legal, financial, or social resources that would have allowed them to create a parallel record. Their perspective on what happened, what they understood, what they were told, what they experienced, survived only to the extent that they were able to speak about it later in life, and only to the extent that anyone recorded what they said. In many cases, neither of those conditions was met. The institutions themselves had every reason to document their work in the most favorable terms available. Annual reports, funding applications, public communications, and even internal records were produced by people who understood that these documents might be examined by donors, government overseers, or other external parties with authority over the institution. Documents produced under those conditions are not neutral accounts. They are presentations. They reflect choices about what to include, what to emphasize, and what to leave unrecorded. Treating them as straightforward historical evidence, without accounting for the conditions under which they were produced, is one of the methodological challenges that researchers in this field consistently navigate. So the picture that survives is partial. Not slightly partial. Significantly partial, in ways that systematically favor certain kinds of information over others. The information most likely to survive is the information the institutions themselves chose to record and preserve. The information least likely to survive is the information that would most directly answer the questions the official account leaves open. That asymmetry is not accidental. It is a product of the same power imbalance that shaped how the system operated in the first place. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because a partial record does not simply mean that some questions cannot be answered with certainty. It means that the conclusions drawn from what survives must be held carefully, with an awareness that the full picture may look different from the partial one. Researchers working with incomplete archives are always working with a version of the story that has already been filtered by time, by institutional interest, by the accidents of preservation, and by the systematic absence of voices that were never given the means to document themselves. That awareness does not make the existing evidence meaningless. What survives is real. The patterns documented across multiple countries and multiple investigations are genuine patterns, not constructions. The formal acknowledgements of harm that governments in several countries have made are based on evidence that met the standard required for official recognition. The scale established by independent inquiries is not a product of interpretive excess. These things are established. But established findings and complete understanding are not the same thing. The findings establish that harm occurred, at scale, across a system that described itself in humanitarian terms. They do not establish, with a kind of clarity that would end scholarly debate, exactly why the system worked the way it did, whose interests it was ultimately serving, and how much of what happened was the product of design versus drift versus the unintended consequences of structural features that no one fully anticipated. Were these the predictable failures of a well-meaning but imperfect welfare system? That interpretation is supported by evidence of genuine humanitarian motivation, by the real economic hardships of the era, and by the documented belief of many reformers in the value of what they were doing. But it struggles to account for the strategic elements, the deliberate framing choices, the legal structures that limited family rights, the funding models that incentivized high occupancy. Were they the result of financial incentives that quietly distorted a system whose original purpose was genuine? That interpretation accounts for the structural pressures and the patterns of outcome. But it does not fully explain the ideological dimensions, the cultural and religious shaping of children in ways that went beyond anything required by simple financial incentive. Or does the pattern suggest something more deliberate, a systematic reshaping of poor and immigrant families, carried out under the cover of humanitarian language, in service of social, cultural, and economic goals that the public framing was designed to obscure? That interpretation has the most explanatory power for the ideological and structural features together. But it implies a degree of coordinated intent that the evidence, spread across many independent institutions in many different countries, does not consistently demonstrate. The honest answer, after everything, is that historians continue to debate this. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the evidence is complex, partial, and open to more than one serious interpretation. The investigations conducted in multiple countries have confirmed that harm occurred. They have not produced agreement about why. And the absence of that agreement, among people who have spent serious time with the relevant records, is itself information. It tells us something about the nature of the question and the nature of the evidence available to answer it. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because the persistence of scholarly disagreement about a well-documented historical system, one that operated for well over a century across multiple countries and affected millions of children, suggests that something about this history is genuinely resistant to the kind of clear accounting that would allow the question to be closed. Part of that resistance comes from the record's incompleteness. Part of it comes from the complexity of a system that was never unified, never centrally directed, and never operating with a single set of motivations across all its many contexts. And part of it comes from the difficulty of the underlying question itself, the difficulty of determining, from the outside and from a distance of time, whether a system that caused harm was designed to cause it, allowed to cause it, or simply failed to prevent it despite intentions that were, in some cases and in some measure, genuine. What remains, at the end of this investigation, is a set of questions that have not been fully answered and a record that cannot fully answer them. The orphanage system, its scale, its patterns, its gap between stated purpose and actual outcome, sits in the historical record as something that has been partially examined, formally acknowledged in some of its dimensions, and interpreted in genuinely different ways by serious researchers who have worked with the same evidence. The children who passed through it, and the families who were separated by it, lived experiences that the surviving record can only partially reconstruct. What drove the system, at the level that would explain everything the records show, remains, in some important and probably permanent ways, out of reach. Not because no one has looked, but because the record that would close the question is not the record that survived. And what remains is what it has always been, a partial picture, a set of open questions, and an honest acknowledgement that the full story of the orphanage system has not yet been, and may never be, completely told. After examining everything that the records contain, and after sitting with the questions that the records cannot answer, it becomes necessary to consider something that formal historical inquiry rarely addresses directly. What does it mean to study a system whose full story cannot be recovered? What does it mean to acknowledge harm at scale while being unable to fully explain the mechanisms that produced it? And what does the persistence of these open questions tell us about the way this particular history has been treated, not just by the institutions involved, but by the broader societies that allowed those institutions to operate, funded them, celebrated them, and then, for a long time, did not ask too many questions about what they had actually done? These are not rhetorical questions. They point toward a dimension of this history that sits beyond the archival record and beyond the scope of formal investigation. They point toward the question of how a system this large, operating for this long, affecting this many families, managed to remain so thoroughly unexamined for so much of the time it was in operation. And that question, the question of the silence surrounding this history, is one that the investigations themselves have not fully resolved. The silence was not absolute. There were always people who knew something was wrong. Former residents of these institutions who carried their experiences with them into adulthood. Parents who had placed children and found the process of reclaiming them unexpectedly difficult. Social workers and reformers of later generations who began to notice that the outcomes the system produced did not match the purposes it described. The awareness existed. But it existed at the margins. It existed among the people who had the least power to bring it into public view. And the institutions at the center of the system continued to operate, to receive funding, to maintain their public reputations, and to produce their annual reports and fundraising materials in language that described a very different reality from the one that critics at the margins were trying to articulate. This is where it becomes unclear why the gap between the two accounts, the official one and the one held by those most directly affected, persisted for as long as it did. Part of the answer lies in power. The institutions had it. The families most affected by them did not. And in a system where the powerful control the documentation tends to reflect the perspective of the powerful. That is not a new observation. It is one of the oldest problems in historical research. But it applies with particular force to this history, where the gap between institutional record and lived experience was wide, and where the people whose experiences diverged most sharply from the official account had the fewest means of making that divergence visible. Part of the answer also lies in the moral authority that the humanitarian framing provided. An institution understood by the public as a place of charitable rescue for orphaned children occupies a particular position in the social imagination. It is not easily criticized. To question it is to appear to be questioning the welfare of vulnerable children, which is a position that most people are reluctant to take publicly. That moral shield, built from the language of rescue, of orphans, of charitable mission, was effective not just in generating donations but in discouraging scrutiny. It created a kind of protective framing around the institutions that made sustained critical examination socially uncomfortable in ways that other types of organizations did not benefit from to the same degree. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because the moral authority of the humanitarian framing did not disappear when individual institutions behaved in ways that contradicted it. It persisted. It continued to shape public understanding even as the gap between the framing and the reality was being documented, quietly, in the records that researchers would later examine. The framing was resilient in a way that suggests it was doing something more than simply describing the institutions it surrounded. It was protecting them. And the question of how a framing that was, by the evidence, significantly inaccurate managed to remain so durable for so long is one that this history raises without fully answering. There is also something in the geography of this history that deserves attention. The orphanage system did not operate only within the borders of the countries where children were admitted. In several well-documented programs, children were physically moved, transported across significant distances, sometimes across oceans, to be placed in labor arrangements or settled with families in regions far from their places of origin. Programs that moved children from Britain to Canada, Australia, and other parts of what was then the British Empire placed tens of thousands of children in locations so distant from their families of origin that the practical possibility of reunion, even for families who wanted it and were able to pursue it, was effectively eliminated by geography alone. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because physical distance is not simply an inconvenient side effect of a placement program. It is a structural feature that has consequences. A child placed 2 streets away from their family is in a fundamentally different situation from a child placed on another continent. The distance made reunion not just administratively difficult but practically impossible for most families who lacked the financial resources to pursue it across such spans. And the programs that created that distance were organized, deliberate, and operated at scale. They were not accidents. They were designed. And the question of what they were designed to achieve, beyond the stated purposes of providing children with opportunities and relieving overcrowding in urban institutions, is one that the historical record raises without fully resolving. Some researchers who have examined these migration programs in detail describe them as among the most difficult aspects of this history to account for within the standard humanitarian framework. The scale, the distances involved, the ages of the children transported, and the conditions many of them encountered at their destinations. All of these features sit uncomfortably within an account organized around child welfare and charitable mission. They fit more naturally within accounts that emphasize the interests of receiving economies, the ideological agenda of populating particular regions with particular types of people, and the systematic use of poor children as a resource to be distributed according to needs that had nothing to do with the welfare of the children themselves. But this is where it becomes unclear whether any single framework can hold all of the evidence. The migration programs, the local placements, the funding structures, the admission processes, the public framing. These are all parts of the same broad system, but they operated differently in different contexts and served different combinations of interests in different places. An account that explains one dimension of the system well may not explain another equally well. And the attempt to find a single explanation that covers everything the records show across all the relevant countries and all the relevant periods is one that researchers have not yet successfully completed. What this history ultimately leaves behind is not a solved problem. It leaves a documented pattern, a set of formal acknowledgements, a collection of competing interpretations, and a body of open questions that the surviving record cannot close. The questions about intent, about structure, about who benefited and who bore the cost, about what the people inside the system understood versus what they communicated. These questions remain present in the archives, in the gaps between documents, and in the distance between the official account and the experiences of the families most directly affected. The children who passed through these institutions are, for the most part, no longer living. The parents who placed them, or who had them taken, are gone. The administrators who ran the institutions, the reformers who advocated for them, the government officials who funded and regulated them, all of them are beyond the reach of any investigation. What remains are the documents they left behind, selected and shaped by the same forces that shaped the system itself. And those documents, read carefully and honestly, tell a story that is larger, more complicated, and more troubling than the one the system told about itself. That story has been partially recovered. Through formal investigations, through the testimony of survivors recorded before they were gone, through the careful work of researchers who have spent years in archives comparing what was said publicly with what was recorded privately. That recovery is real and it matters. It has changed the official understanding of this history in countries that have conducted serious investigations. It has produced formal acknowledgements that would not have seemed possible a generation ago. But partial recovery is not complete recovery. And the parts of this story that have not been recovered, the conversations never recorded, the documents never preserved, the experiences never documented, those absences are permanent. They will not be filled by future discoveries. The people who could have filled them are gone. The records that might have filled them no longer exist. What remains is what will always remain. A picture that is real, that is significant, that is disturbing in its implications, and that is, by the nature of what survived and what did not, permanently incomplete. And that incompleteness is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about this history at the end of a long examination of it. Not that the questions are unanswerable in principle, but that the answers, in their fullest form, are no longer available. The orphanage system, what it was, what it did, what drove it, and whose interests it truly served, remains, in the ways that matter most, an open question. One that the records point toward without resolving. One that the investigations have narrowed without closing. And one that sits, quietly, in the gap between what the system said it was and what the evidence suggests it may have actually been. There is one more thing worth considering before this investigation is set aside. It involves not just what the orphanage system did, but what it left behind in the people who passed through it. The formal investigations, the archival research, the government inquiries, these have all focused, necessarily, on documents, on numbers, on patterns that can be traced through records and verified through evidence. That focus is appropriate for historical investigation, but it captures only part of what this system produced. The other part is harder to document and harder to quantify. It exists in the lives of the people who grew up inside these institutions and carried that experience with them into adulthood. In the families that were separated and never fully reassembled. In the cultural identities that were interrupted or erased when children were moved away from their communities of origin and placed into environments designed to reshape them according to different values and different expectations. These are outcomes that do not appear cleanly in admission registers or funding documents. They appear in lives. And lives, unlike documents, do not survive in archives. Some of the people who lived through these institutions did eventually speak about their experiences, in testimony collected by formal inquiries, in interviews conducted by researchers, in personal accounts recorded before those individuals were gone. What those accounts describe varies. Some describe institutions that were harsh but that provided genuine stability during genuinely difficult periods. Others describe experiences of isolation, of confusion, of being separated from everything familiar without adequate explanation or preparation. Some describe attempts to return to families that proved more complicated than they had expected, in some cases because the family itself had changed significantly during the years of separation, and in other cases because the separation had created distances that proved difficult to bridge even when the physical reunification eventually occurred. These personal accounts do not resolve the historical debate about intent and structure. They are not statistical evidence. But they are a dimension of this history that the formal record, on its own, cannot provide. And they complicate the picture in ways that both the charitable interpretation and the more critical interpretations struggle to fully absorb. Because the experiences described in these accounts are not uniform. They do not all point in the same direction. They resist the kind of clean narrative, either of rescue or of exploitation, that would make this history easier to summarize and easier to close. That resistance is itself something worth noting. A history this large, affecting this many people over this many decades, was never going to produce uniform experiences. The institutions varied. The people who ran them varied. The circumstances of individual families varied enormously. And the experiences of the children inside varied accordingly. Any account of this system that flattens that variation, that describes all institutions as the same, all administrators as motivated by the same forces, all families as having the same experience of the same process, is an account that is easier to state but less accurate than the evidence actually supports. What the evidence supports is complexity. A system that was genuinely responsive to real need in some of its operations and genuinely harmful in others. A system whose stated purpose was not entirely fictitious but whose actual function frequently diverged from that purpose in ways that the official account was not designed to acknowledge. A system that helped some children and harmed others, that reflected genuine humanitarian concern in some of its dimensions and structural exploitation in others, and that resists the kind of single verdict that would make it easier to place in the historical record and move past. That complexity is uncomfortable. It is easier to conclude that the system was simply bad, or simply good, or simply a product of its time that should be judged by the standards of its own era rather than ours. Each of those conclusions has a version of the evidence that supports it. None of them has all of the evidence. And the honest position, The one that the full body of research most consistently points toward is that this system was all of these things simultaneously, in different proportions in different places and different periods, and that the full accounting of what it was and what it did remains genuinely unfinished. That unfinished quality is where this history rests. Not at a conclusion, not at a verdict, but at a recognition that what happened inside these institutions, to these children and these families, was significant enough to have warranted far more scrutiny than it received while it was occurring, and complex enough that the scrutiny applied after the fact has still not produced the kind of complete understanding that the scale of what happened deserves. The records point toward questions. The questions remain open. And the people whose lives were shaped by the answers are no longer here to provide them.